Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another metagame breakdown, the fifth in the series. Today we're gonna sort of give a welfare and goodbye to the old metagame because we're looking at stats pre-patch, so keep that in mind. Some of these things will change drastically with the next data set, but we can't look into the future, we can only look into the past with data, so that's the way it has to be. Might still be interesting and educational to an extent, but maybe less long-term relevant than the last couple times. Anyway, before we get started, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button down below, turn on the notification icon to not miss out on future content. And now let's take a look. So, as usual, we're going to look at the top 5 most played decks first, followed by the top 5 decks with the highest win rate, and see what that means, and I'll give you some added information where I can. So first off, we have Alansky's Karma Control. This is the most popular deck in this dataset. Also noteworthy, the numbers are a lot smaller this time. Mobalytics had some issues. I think they said they had something around like 30% data loss. So while the games have gone down a bit from last week, not remotely as much as they seem because there's a lot of data lost. But since the data that was lost is more or less random, it shouldn't affect the overall picture too much. And once again, keep in mind the lists we're looking at here are the most popular versions of these archetypes, not necessarily the best or the one that I would recommend, since we only have data for the most popular ones, and I think I want to keep this data driven and not like my personal preferences or anything. But I'll give you my thoughts and my opinion. So for example, if we look at this list as the most popular list, as usual, you can find all the data sheets, both of the Mobalytics data sheets for the archetypes and for the overall stats in the description down below. Most popular list of the Karma Control has only a win rate of barely 52% over like more than 360 games, the list we're looking at, while the archetype as a whole has a win rate of 53 point something%. So there's a bit of a discrepancy. It's not super huge, but there might be an indication, since I think the most likely other variants that differ from this will be the sort of older Darkwater Scourge Deathmark variants, which might in fact be overall superior to this approach. I'm not 100% sure, and it's only an indication, but that is something that this discrepancy could hint at, and something that wouldn't like necessarily totally surprise me, since at least from my standpoint, when I faced the decks that I've played, more often than not, I was much more concerned if they are on Deathmark Scourge than if they weren't, because the early game is pretty weak and Deathmark Scourge is a really strong catch-up turn 3, while all the other things aren't really, and make it a lot harder for aggressive decks like my discard aggro to sort of run away with the game. So that's something to keep in mind if you're into this archetype, to like look into and make sure that you're playing the best version, the best performing version, and compare results of versions. Anyway, on to the second one. Second most popular is BruisedByGod's Rekindler Demacia, pretty close behind. This deck is probably going to be obsolete in its current form. I think there will be some form of heavy Demacia Bannerman deck. We'll see if it's either just the more aggressive version, basically the Demacia Aggro with Z, or sometimes also Shadow Assassin instead of Z, or will it be just a different take on this mid-range version, or will people even keep playing Rekindler? We already know that BruisedByGod, for example, has moved to 2 Deny and 0 Rekindler as his take, and just basically is running like the full playset of Sidria, the Bold, to make up for it, and yeah, is still going strong with it, so the core of the deck is very robust. The splash is probably just gonna adapt a bit, giving the deck different strengths and weaknesses to an extent. The win rate for this has been gone down quite a bunch. It was doing really well initially, in part due to the metagame being vulnerable to it and people not knowing it as well, and now it has stabilized more. Like this specific list we are looking at is sitting at like 55%, and the overall archetype is sitting at basically the same win rate. Like the win rate discrepancy between the most popular list and the archetype as a whole is actually like 0.16% win rate. So seems like there's really barely any version fluctuation, and also like no win rate fluctuation, since I would assume the version differences between the most popular and the other lists are very marginal, like maybe 2 detain over the second Cetria, or like basically adjusting some of these one-off slots into other cards. Very minor differences, which doesn't really affect the overall win rate. That's also a nice case to see that if it's just a random subset of the overall data, that the subsets should usually, if they are of a certain size at least, are likely to represent the like overall data, like as in this case 1221 games at 55%, and a subset with almost an identical list being at the same win rate over 400 games. Which is why also the argument that some people are making sometimes that this is only like the players that use the tracker and so on and so forth, but that doesn't really matter, because the people that use the tracker are a non-pre-selected subset of the entirety of Masters players, because it's random who uses the tracker. There's not really like a specific kind of subset of people that use the tracker and a certain subset that doesn't, in a way that it would meaningfully affect the data. Sure, you could certainly try and construct certain kinds of, I don't know, skill level and player type categories that are more or less likely to use the tracker, and that could be some kind of an argument, but overall I think it's more or less a random subset of the entirety of Masters, and therefore pretty representative for the entirety of Masters, since the subset size is big enough to most likely project the entirety of Masters and trends within Masters. Anyway, on to the next deck. Third most popular is still Elusive. They're still hanging around in the middle of the top 5 most played decks, and that's not really going to change anytime soon too much. The patch will change that a bit, maybe, because the nerf to Conspirator is certainly meaningful and means that some of the closer matchups where you just barely got there with exact damage one turn before you lose might now be games that you're losing a lot more often. So that's something to keep in mind. But the deck is still going strong and even recovered from its like win rate dive last week back to its former glory. So that makes it actually pretty interesting what caused this like 5%, more than 5% win rate loss last week, and now and made it now bounce back, because I honestly don't have a good theory on that. If you have an interesting one, let me hear in the comments, because the metagame even hasn't even like changed particularly much this week compared to last week, and it's also at the same time fairly different from 2 weeks ago when the win rate was the same. So we have 2 weeks where the metagame is mostly the same but the win rate drastically different, and we have multiple weeks where the win rate is very similar but the metagame fairly different. So your guess is as good as mine. Maybe, I don't know, Sixo, among others, has been jamming a lot more games with the deck again on his way to like rank 1 and bringing up the win rate. Maybe that helped. But we don't even know if those games are in this data set and how many they are, and if they are all in there and so on. And yeah, so, and it's also probably only a fraction of the game, so that's unlikely that like the hardcore Elusive guy that did really well is responsible for this drastic shift. So I'm out of ideas on that one. All right, in place 4 we have Tier Red's Z Hackerim Deathmark deck. Note here, I refuse to call this a mid-range deck. I think that's kind of a bad NOMA for this deck, because the deck is not actually like your typical mid-range deck. It's more of a like weird tempo aggro control type deck, and tempo is actually kind of a bad term in the sense that the deck is anything but about tempo in the typical sense, but it has very similar matchup dynamics as tempo or aggro control decks, in the sense that it's kind of soft to aggressive decks because it has kind of a weak early game and a slow start, but it's extremely good at destroying control decks and slow decks. So yeah, the deck is kind of a bit hard to categorize and has this sort of adaptive playstyle thing. And yeah, I think describing it as a mid-range deck is just not very helpful, because it very much mischaracterizes its strengths and weaknesses and its overall like play pattern and structure. Like, it's just not the kind of robust value type thing that traditional mid-range usually is defined by, and traditional mid-range also is defined by having a very good aggro matchup and a weak control matchup, while this deck kind of has the opposite. But as we can see here, now the most popular list is Tier Red's list. Funny enough, bit backstory here, I talked to Swim about this. He updated his tier list from the list that he was recommending before to a Tier Red's list, which once again shows how much impact prominent content creator figures have in a gaming community. And now the most popular version is the Tier Red version by almost 400 games. And also noteworthy, the win rate of this list over those 375 games is almost 65%, which is amazing. And the overall Archetypes win rate is still 59.6, which is, I think, still like a 1.5, bit more than 1.5% uptick from last week, if I'm not mistaken, or like 1%. I think last week it was like 58.9, so it's like 0.7 only. I misremembered that, but it still means that the overall archetype benefited from this shift, and there's still probably a fair share of people playing inferior versions or playing the deck worse, but as you can see, playing the right list and playing it well can lead to an astounding win rate over like 375 games. Like, having 65% win rate over almost 400 games is pretty good. So that definitely stands out here, and yeah, nice to see that Swim adjusted there, and yeah, just had a positive impact on this data set and the popularity of lists as a result. Anyway, on to the fifth most popular deck. That's still Ezreal. Ezreal is still hanging in the top 5. We'll probably see that change with the next data set now that Elnox are gone. I'm sure Ezreal can adjust by just swapping those with potentially something like Flash of Brilliance and Heimerdinger. Like, it's more what the Asians do, it's more popular in Asia that way. But the change to Flash of Brilliance, while being an improvement in like Heimerdinger Lux decks, for example, it is a nerf in Ezreal decks, since Ezreal cares more about getting cheap spells from Flash of Brilliance than getting 6-cost spells, making the sort of second half of Flash of Brilliance pretty bad with Ezreal, while before the upside was that Flash of Brilliance synergized with Ezreal and Heimerdinger, and now it mostly synergizes with Heimerdinger. Anyway, this particular list looks a lot cleaner than before. I like that, no more rummage and stuff. At least 2 Get Excited. Like, I think 2 Get Excited is much better than 1. I'm still skeptical on like 2 over 3. I haven't played the deck much myself, but I have played against it a lot, and from my experience, I die a lot to just being burned out barely, including a Get Excited, and it's often the Get Excited that is getting my opponent there. So yeah, skeptical on 2 versus 3, but it's nice to see that the most popular list now is back to at least 2. Also on the win rate, this specific list actually has an impressive win rate of 66% over 174 games, while the overall archetype is doing fine, but not that amazing, but it's like constantly doing better, and now it reached a 57.1%. So the archetype constantly is getting better, which partially probably has to do with its popularity dropping, the metagame, and people not respecting it as much anymore, and also a lot more people playing it for longer and becoming more proficient with the archetype is also a factor I would assume plays a role here. Anyway, that's the 5 most popular decks. No big changes here, basically just very familiar decks, which makes sense. We didn't have new content, not even a patch, so there's only so much fluctuation and shift in terms of like people trying to sort of attack the metagame and making things a bit shift. Stuff that's worse positioned gets less popular, new stuff that's well positioned pops up, and so on. It's still like a bit of a circular development even without new content usually, but not like major shifts, just like repositioning basically. All right, on to the top 5 best performing decks. First off, Elusives are back on top. Actually, has been a while since they were on top. They were in second place a lot, behind Spiders, but they pulled ahead of Spiders. 61.5% is back to its former glory. And yeah, not too surprised, as I said last week. Decks seem pretty well positioned, and seems like more people capitalized on that, and the data shows it was well positioned, and now it's doing well again. So yeah, this is still my list. Also noteworthy here as well, that also partially has to do with Swim, because the list he recommends is 2 Deny, 2 Will of Ionia, that by now the most popular version is actually the 2 Deny, 2 Will of Ionia version, while before it was the 3 Will, 1 Deny. It might be correct to still run 3 Will, and the only way to accomplish that, in my opinion, would be cutting the 3rd Jewel Protector to fit that, which seems like a fine change. The card can be a bit slower and a bit clunky sometimes, and drawing multiples is awkward, so that seemed like the most cuttable card to me, honestly, to fit a 3rd Will, much more so than cutting a Deny. And I'm still a fan of the Noxus Splash over Freljord, but most people play Freljord, so that's why we have Freljord here. On to Spiders. Spiders is constantly losing some percentages from week to week. I mean, 60% is still really good, but it lost basically like about 1% per week over like the last 3 weeks from its peak of like 63 point something. But it's also doing pretty well in terms of popularity. It's actually the 6th most popular archetype, barely not making the top 5 list. This list is still pretty random and unrefined. If you ask me, I would recommend something closer to my old list from my deck tech, but you can find my most recent list on my mobalytics page usually, and I keep updating it. Basically, this Decimate over Darius makes no sense in a deck that has no burn, for example. Not playing any Might doesn't make any sense to me either. The card has been pretty important. This list plays too many 2-drops, and on the same hand is a little light on 1-drops. So yeah, kind of a messy, unclean, unstreamlined list. But it's the most popular one. I think it's the one that Swim at least had been putting up on his tier list as the go-to list, which once again emphasizes his influence on Legends of Runeterra's metagame. Maybe I can convince him to put up a more streamlined list like I was mentioning, and then we'll see some shift and maybe even some regain in win percentage as well. We'll see. But basically I think Spiders is a slightly worse version of the Jinx Draven deck that I have been doing really well with, so might want to check out the deck tech on that one on my channel if you're looking for a good aggro deck. The nerf to crowd favorite matters, but I don't think it's going to invalidate the card or the deck by any means. It's just going to make the card less dominating, and the card was very dominating. Like, the card is tied for best Noxus card with Brothers Bond and is extremely strong, and the main reason, in my opinion, why these Noxus based aggro decks like Spiders or Discard are as strong as they are. It's a big contributing factor. Alright, in third place we have the mentioned teal-red Z Hecarim Deathmark deck at 59.6%, so this climbed a bunch as I mentioned earlier. And yeah, not too surprised, it's a really good deck. We'll see how the deck can survive with the changes though. The Hecarim change isn't that big of a deal actually, given that the deck is one of the decks that's pretty consistently leveling up Hecarim, and that goes quicker now, and it even sometimes matters that the buff to ephemerals is bigger now, but the cost increase to Rekindler is a pretty heavy blow to an already a bit slow and sluggish deck, so not sure if the deck can survive, but we will see. Next we have the good old Fearsome Rally. This is the list by Tilted22, the list he used in the EU Creators Invitational as part of his winning lineup. Bit skeptical of like zero harrowing, but other than that the list looks pretty nice. I would probably try something like cutting a Chronicler and a Mistcall for 2 harrowing, but otherwise the list is really nice. I like at least one Chronicler with Racecaller and Mistcall with Racecaller, and Hecarim and Rekindler is pretty powerful too. Just same old, but I think the deck is basically dead now in its current form, between the nerfs to Hecarim mattering a lot in a deck that doesn't really level it, the nerf to Rekindler also being painful, so yeah, the deck might be gone for good. Like, it's not like terrible, but I don't think there's enough incentive to play it anymore, and the win rate is going to be like barely above 50% probably, so Mistrace, Racecaller stuff might have to reinvent itself. We'll see how that goes. But last week it was still going pretty strong and made it into the top 5, as it has been for like a long time. And last but not least, we have Ezreal right behind, 0.1% behind Rally, which is a first for Ezreal to perform well enough to make it into the top 5. Highest win rate decks, so for all the Ezreal fans, that's probably exciting, since aside from a couple of individuals that have been doing particularly well with the archetype, overall the archetype has consistently been doing pretty mediocre in terms of win rate. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the factors contributing to this change might be things like people getting better with the deck, people expecting it less because it's less popular and being more vulnerable to it and stuff like that. If you have any other theories, as usual, let me know in the comments. Always interesting to get other perspectives and discuss these things. So yeah, these are the top 5 most popular and top 5 highest win rate decks. We'll see which of these decks can survive the patch and how they adapt, and also how their win rates adjust. And that's going to be pretty interesting, like the first data dump after a balance patch, especially a big one like the last one, is always particularly exciting and interesting. So I'm looking forward to that one, the coming Sunday, if they can put it out as intended. Otherwise, probably Monday or Tuesday. I think this week it took till Monday or Tuesday again for it to be out, like late Monday or late Tuesday, which is why it took me a while to put it out again. But both mobalytics and I myself try to minimize delays. They delay on putting out the data, and me delay to putting out the video after the data is out. So I hope this is getting better gradually in the coming weeks. So yeah, until then, hope you guys enjoy the breakdown, and yeah, let me know what you think, how your experience of the metagame was, what you think of our top 5 this week. And yeah, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more, share it with your friends, and of course, make sure your ad block is turned off on YouTube to help support all your favorite content creators for free. That's it again for this time. I'm your host ManuS. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.